Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tadaima Virtual Pilgrimage. My name is Rob Buscher, and I'm the Film Festival curator. I'm also the board chair at the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. Today, we're joined by the co-directors of The Registry, one of the feature-length documentaries that has been featured during week 4 of the pilgrimage. Give a big welcome to Steve Ozone and Bill Kubota. Thank you guys for joining us, and we're excited to have this conversation, I think, because so much of this week has really dealt with the history of Japanese-American military service. And, you know, the common narrative is often around the 100th Battalion, the 442nd, and the European front of the war. Very few people know about the Pacific Front individuals who participated, and particularly the folks that were in the military intelligence service, which was really what your film was all about. So I'm excited that we're able to highlight that lesser known experience within the history of Japanese American military service in World War II. And although I would assume that most of our audience have already watched your film, I'm wondering if you guys could just give us a very brief introduction to the MIS and perhaps how you got involved in the making of this film.
Why don't you go ahead, Bill, and then I'll talk about how we got involved.
Okay. I was familiar of MIS going way back, but our interest is really about, I think, the last vets that were still alive from that time. We wanted to just get their stories, but we found out that they, I think they really wanted to tell their stories a lot, but a lot of their friends and relatives didn't know or weren't listening. And so that was kind of how we saw this story, as a profile of two of the guys that created this big list of all the people that were in this unit, because there was no official list of the military intelligence service members. And so that was the jumping off for the story. Two guys, one in Minneapolis, and that's the main reason we started this film, was because it had a base in Minneapolis. And that's what Steve can talk a lot about, because he lives there. I live in Detroit, so.
So one day, Bill and I have worked on a project in Minneapolis before. It was oral history among the Nisei in the community. And then we finished that and it went really well, and we started talking about other ideas. And one day Bill just asked me if he had heard of this guy named Seiki Oshiro. And Seiki had started this list of students that attended the Military Intelligence Service language school, which was at one time in Minneapolis, at Fort Snelling, actually at St. Paul. And I contacted Seiki. We talked, and he had a great story to tell. And so we decided to go ahead and apply for a Japanese American confinement sites grant from the National Park Service, and we got that, and that was the start of the film.
Seiki's story is interesting. He just happened to be in Minnesota because post-war, that's where a lot of computer companies, at least Control Data was a big computer company. And he was in computers after the war, and he ended up moving to Minneapolis area. And so it was coincidental that he was in the same area where the school was. And the school was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Fort Snelling, because it was one of the few places anywhere that was willing to allow Japanese Americans to go to school there. They wouldn't. There was a school for training Japanese Americans how to speak and write and read Japanese, because you would think, oh, they know that. Well, they didn't really, but they a bunch of these guys came out of camps, internment camps, and from Hawaii to learn to do this so they could play a part in the war in the Pacific when they fought the Japanese. So this is how this whole story is about. And there's several thousand of these guys that served in the Pacific, assigned to all these military units across the Pacific theater of war. And that's kind of what our story ends up talking about, but it was really a profile of a few of those guys. And that's what our film's about. And a lot of it is what's going on current day, at least within the past 10 years or so of their lives. We're kind of following them around. That's what the registry is really all about.
And Seiki is still working on it after 19 years.
He was adept with computers, so he could actually build this database, and that's kind of what the story is sort of about too. A lot of these folks of the World War II generation aren't that adept with modern technology, but here's that modern technology kind of saving their history.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the most remarkable pieces about this particular story, because I think a lot of times, and even in the Japanese American community context, a lot of these kinds of stories surface after a younger generation begins asking questions. Mm-hmm. And yet in this particular case, it's almost the entirely opposite situation, where you have a lot of individuals who were actually bound by secrecy, right? Because a lot of them were under strict national security clearance for at least a period of time, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of some of the MIS service. And then having this ability of an individual to come together and really create a space for that community to reconnect, at least among those who are still left.
That's part of the story. I think really when it comes down to this documentary, it's almost more about the Sansei, the third generation, trying to relate to their fathers that were in this war. And, they want to ask their dads these questions, but, they don't know what questions to ask. And so some of them they're not finding out anything till they're long gone, looking through old papers and that sort of thing. Or in other cases, it's just hard to talk about these things. There's some trauma involved with being in the war, and it's hard for them to talk about the real things that happened to them. It's a lot about, I went here and I did this, but not how they really felt about the war while they were in it. And so, but that's common with a whole generation of people, not just the Nisei.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting too, because in one sense, I think the 442nd and 100th Battalion were so popularized during the war itself, just in terms of some of the newsreels that featured them in their service, particularly around the Texas Lost Battalion. But in the case of the Japanese Americans who served in the Pacific Front, it's almost like each person had such a unique experience, because there were few of them serving in the same regiment at a given time. It would almost take each one of them opening up about their experiences to get a comprehensive viewpoint. Whereas, a large grouping of the 442 or 100th Battalion, you only need a couple people to start the story, which then other people are able to contribute their own experiences into. So it's another complicated thing.
And also, their existence was classified until the mid-70s, 1970s. So I think they were used to not talking about it, and so their children didn't know what questions to ask because they didn't know anything about it.
That was totally the
when they
case
don't
with
have-
us, right? When we were
Yeah.
talking, one of the guys who lived in
Yeah.
Arizona, he died a few years ago, Masanoshita. He would tell us anything we wanted to hear, but
Mhm.
we didn't know what to ask him. You know, he was really willing to talk, but and in fact, I think more willing than some of these guys. Some of these guys are still cagey with their answers, but he was really very open.
Mhm.
But it was really rough to just because they're not thinking like, you know, journalistically, or I guess that's how I think about it. What's the big highlight of your life? They're not thinking about it that way. So we didn't, you know, he had done all sorts of things that we don't even know about, you know, we'll never know about. And we were with him opening this big trunk of stuff that he had. It's in the film with his daughter. And you could see for the first time his daughter's learning about what happened to him because he's pulling out stuff that was going on before the war. It turned out he wanted to be an actor, you know. It was really interesting and really poignant. And you could see Marilyn, the daughter's going, I didn't know that. And they don't share anything with their kids. But, you know, it's a combination of the kid's not asking. It's not the right time. He didn't think it was important, which is probably stereotypically the way we think of Nisei men anyway, not sharing a whole lot. But that's what we saw.
Yeah. And then on the other end of that story was Karen Matsumoto and her dad, Roy. Karen made a film about her dad. And so she knew a lot about what he did. But in the film, she says, I still have a lot of questions that I never got to ask my dad, but I didn't want it to bother him because he was close to the end of his life. And she just wanted him to be able to enjoy the rest of his life without thinking about things that happened all those years ago.
Yeah, and we had actually featured that film as part of the program this week as well. So I think, you know, Roy Matsumoto's story is definitely one of the better known out of the MIS. But again, you know, that idea that there were so many others, and I think it was great, first of all, that the registry exists so that these stories can be surfaced. But then, of course, a testament to your film as well, and being able to bring that into more of a public-facing arena. And I'm curious, because you mentioned that the registry is still active. Could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of what the current status is? Have there been other attempts made at bringing some of the MIS folks together in person? Are there even enough individuals left to be able to do something like that?
Well, as far as the list, as far as the registry still being active, Seiki is working with a woman in Hawaii, and they're trying to add people's names from, what is it, the University of Hawaii, Bill? I think it is.
I think so.
There's from their archives, and so they've been working on that for the last 2 or 3 years. And I don't know exactly where they are on that, but as far as I know, that's the only thing that's being done as far as updating the registry. A lot of those guys are in their, well, everybody's in their 90s now, so there's not many of them around anymore.
Yeah, I'm curious, you know, in making a documentary film, obviously you must have had hours and hours, if not days of footage that just wasn't possible to include. I always like to ask our documentarians, what's the most interesting story that you had to cut for some reason? You don't have to give the reason, but if you have a particular story or moment that got cut on the cutting room floor that you'd be able to share with us.
Well, for me, it's a segment that exists in the long version of the program that hasn't been seen a whole lot. One of the people we featured was a guy named Cedric Shimo. He just died a few months ago. And he was one of the first guys to get into the MIS. He was already pretty fluent in Japanese growing up in LA. And, but
he was a Kibe, so he was really fluent. He was fluent because, so Kibe is a Japanese born or Japanese person of Japanese ancestry that's born in the States and then goes back to Japan for education. So his level of Japanese was pretty high.
And it was so high that he got like moved along in these Japanese language classes very quickly in Minnesota. And they're getting ready to send him out to the Pacific. And he wanted to go see his mom in Manzanar, the camp in California, in Eastern California. Out in the desert in the middle of nowhere, and they wouldn't let him because that was part of the restricted area where Japanese Americans weren't allowed to go, California. So he complained really loudly and he got kicked out of the MIS. So to us, we're saying this guy is like basically, I don't know if you've heard about a lot of people that were not happy about being drafted into the war, Nisei, that were going to be drafted into the 442nd, 100th. That were called resistors, a lot of them. They were against the draft because their rights were taken away because they were sent to camp. Well, he was kind of like the first resistor because then they sent him to all these work camps with all these other, basically military units with other Italians and German people, Italian, German extraction that were just the work crews, you know, like they were like, I don't know what you call those guys, but they were like stateside, a stateside unit that dug ditches. You know, they were the
they would repair roads and bridges that were used in training.
But what happened was he was allowed to take pictures this whole time while he was in the Army. Mm-hmm. And he had this little camera and he had all these pictures, which he ended up giving to the Japanese American National Museum. So we have a scene in the film where he's actually showing these pictures to other MIS guys that were also docents, because he was a docent at the museum, and they had no idea. Nobody had any idea, but he's talking about he basically got demoted 3 times. They wanted to discharge him dishonorably. He complained about that, and he ended up getting an honorable discharge. And after that, he ended up being a vice president for Honda. You know, on the state side, I mean, he's a really successful guy, and he's just a great guy. He had this, I don't know, this charisma that even though he complained and spoke truth to power, he just kept moving up anyway. So he was a real fascinating guy. He didn't serve in the Pacific, but it was really kind of emblematic of the I don't know, the contradictions of serving your country that treats you so badly, you know.
Absolutely.
That was one of my favorite stories too, and to add to that was the other docents at JANM, Japanese American National Museum. They didn't know about Cedric being kicked out of MIS, and they didn't believe him when he told people.
He wasn't really talking about it, but when we were following him around with the camera, they're asking him, "Why are they taking pictures of you?" He goes. And he started telling a story to this one woman, a very nice woman. He goes, "Oh, they kicked me out of the MIS." And she goes, "I don't believe you," said Rick. "You're too nice a guy."
Yeah.
Well, so, that's a pretty incredible story. And, you know, I think it just, again, really illustrates how storied that this bunch was.
I wanted to say that actually my favorite story was Grant Ichikawa, who is in the film. He goes to, and we had to cut this out because of time. He was invited to speak at a Japanese language school that is it's near Washington, D.C. And it was started so that Japanese nationals could send their children to school there and learn Japanese. And so Grant told his story about how he hated going to Japanese school, and but it ended up being that he was able to create his whole career because he went to Japanese school, because he knew the language. And then he talked about volunteering for the MIS. And at the end of his speech, a woman came up to him and said, "How did your parents feel about you volunteering? As a mom, I don't think I would want to have my child volunteer for the Army when they don't want you, when they don't want Japanese in the Army." And it was just the contrast of, what is it, 80 years ago now to the present. And if that had happened now, you wouldn't get volunteers like that were trying to prove their loyalty to their country. There'd be a lot more resistance. And so that shows you how that was the time. It was a moment in time where people's thoughts are just way different than they are now.
And there certainly was a lot to prove, as we all know. And I think in great respect for the MIS folks who, in some ways, had a harder go of it, just in the sense that they couldn't be as open with their families about their history of service. And I guess that's another question I had, because I understand that it was classified, but were they able to, at least, people knew obviously within the community, within their family, that they were serving. They just weren't allowed to talk about what they were doing. Is that accurate?
It's surprising that when they were here, people thought that it was a prisoner of war camp when they were in Minneapolis training, and they were free to come and go from Fort Snelling to downtown Minneapolis on the trolley, and they really weren't told not to talk about it. The reason they came down to downtown Minneapolis because there were Chinese restaurants here, and that was the only place that they could get rice. So they'd have a chance to have rice once or twice a week. I guess the rest of the time it was meat and potatoes at Fort Snelling.
One of the things that I think about as significant with we did one of the stories was about really it was about Frank Abe. He's pretty famous in the Japanese American circles, especially his interest in John Okada, who wrote really the first great Asian American novel, the John Okada within the MIS. And on his gravestone, and it's part of the film, we're looking at it, and it doesn't mention MIS as its unit. He mentions the Army Air Corps unit that he was serving as part of the MIS. That's on his gravestone. And it strikes me that even in his death, MIS was kind of still a secret. He died in the 70s, but there's so many of these people that are writing in that I heard my uncle, my dad, my granddad was in the Pacific, but nobody was sure it was MIS. In fact, one of the other people we featured at the beginning of the film were with his son, and he didn't know for sure it was MIS until he found a diploma. Well, he knew because we called him up to talk to him about it, but he found a MIS diploma in his garage, because it was buried under a bunch of stuff. So it was never identified as MIS to a lot of these guys. They just said, yeah, I was in the Pacific, and left it at that, which doesn't help if you're trying to figure out what your dad did during the war.
Yeah, and I think until very recently, we've seen hardly any depictions whatsoever of individuals who served in that front, and I guess how perilous it may have been for them at times. Again, having what was identified as the face of an enemy.
Right.
And I think for folks who had seen AMC's The Terror, the second season that they did related to the Japanese American incarceration, they did have an episode or two that showed one of the main characters in the Pacific Front. So I think that was probably the first time I had seen that done in a narrative film. And aside from your film and the Roy Matsumoto doc, I'm really not familiar with too many others that talk about that. So it's hopefully this is the start of maybe some more interest in the subject.
You know, I should say that it's interesting. They made a movie back in like early 60s or late 50s called Merrill's Marauders, which is Roy Matsumoto's unit. There was a bunch of one American unit that was put behind enemy lines in Burma. And there was all these exploits this one soldier was doing in that film, including what I think climbing up and listening on a line. He was like eavesdropping on Japanese communications. And that was really Roy Matsumoto that did that, but they changed that character into a Filipino or something in the movie. Mm-hmm. So it was even in the films, the truth was not revealed, even though the heroic action was portrayed. And Roy, I think, was one of the people we knew was somebody we kind of wanted to do the film about originally, but we realized that Karen had already made a film about her dad. But he's the one that I've heard from a couple of people. If somebody should have gotten a Medal of Honor, it should have been Roy. Because there's been Medal of Honor given to a lot of guys in the 442nd, but nobody in the MIS has ever received that.
Yeah, that's a shame. And I would agree with that sentiment. I'm curious, if there are any movement within the last remaining survivors of MIS to get any kind of recognition like that.
In the film, there was the Congressional Gold Medal. That happened in 2011. That was we started shooting in 2011 based on that event in Washington, D.C. And there was a moment that gold medal might have left the MIS off of that as well and may have just given it to the 442nd guys. There was talk about that. But then the, more rational heads prevailed, and they made sure to get MIS guys in there.
Grant Ichikawa and a member of the JACL went around to senators, and Grant told them war stories and convinced them to add the MIS, to include the MIS with the 442 and Hunter's Battalion to receive the medal. That's in the film too.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear too from those folks that I don't know if that's in the film, but it was like there was a lot of people in Congress that weren't supportive of the gold medal. That seemed like a can't lose thing to support a World War II vet. But there were people in Congress and the Senate, that didn't care and we couldn't figure that out. And I go, well, maybe there weren't any Japanese Americans living in their districts, and it's like, well, it ain't about that. But that's one of the things that kind of surprised me after all these years. But that's what we learned there in Washington. It's kind of cynical about a lot of that Washington stuff, but that's just me.
Well, it's hard not to be at times. But we do have a question from the audience that I'd like to bring in. This is from Mieko. Looking at the history of post-war and incarceration in the U.S., there's a lot of division between Nisei veterans and those who refuse to enlist. Did the Nisei vets address this? So I'm guessing they mean specifically the folks who were in MIS, and wondering if you could shed some light on that.
I had, the folks we talked to in our film, it didn't come up, and I didn't sense that there would have been any kind of division with those people that had problems with those. I guess the folks that were, say, the resistors. Although I do know that we, a few of these guys that we were looking at came out of one camp, Gila River in Arizona, and the main story is they had to sneak out of. They were like the first guys to go in the Army. This was long before the 442nd was taking volunteers out of camps, and way before they started drafting guys out of these camps. And they had to get up really early in the morning to get on a bus to get out of there because they were worried about a lot of anger at these guys volunteering. So I didn't get a real feeling that they resented those people that were angry that they were volunteering, but that was there. There was a lot of pushback against those folks, the families of some of these MIS guys that were volunteering, especially with the idea they might go fight Japan. But I don't think there was animosity from them against the folks that were taking that position against them, because they were just trying to move ahead with their lives, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've certainly interacted with a number of 442 vets as well who have taken that position.
And it's interesting to me with Okada's book, No Boy, kind of really goes into that whole complexity of that. And it's a lot more complicated than just you were loyal, you were disloyal, you are standing up for us in the camps, you are selling us out. It's just so much more complicated than that. And that's why it's very nuanced. That's why I was really thought the Okada segment with Frank Abe was so important in our film.
We had, when Seiki and Grant meet, when Grant met, Grant flew up to Minneapolis to meet Seiki. They talked about Cedric Shimo and refusing to serve because he couldn't go see his mother. They, and thinking back, it was a long time ago, but they spoke about him almost in reverence because he stood up for his beliefs and didn't back down. So I think that they looked at serving as it was a personal choice. Whether you serve or you don't serve, it's up to the individual whether they want to serve or not.
And it gets interesting too. Even with Seiki in the film, he goes, "It wasn't for him. It wasn't about loyalty and serve your country.
Yeah,
he just wanted to get off a plantation in Hawaii. It was just terrible." And I think that's a situation for a lot of folks. And that's not just Nisei. It's a lot of these folks that participated in the war. You got to remember there was a depression going on. There was a lot of, what am I going to do with my life? Why not go fight for the army or fight for my country? Weighing the upside downside, let's go fight. And I think I think Grant might have felt that way too a little bit, like, just get me out of here. I'll do anything to get out of this camp. And that's part of it too.
Yeah, that's an important context to provide, because I think, there's a certain element of romanticization that is related to military service in general. And it certainly is definitely heroic, right? And self-sacrificing. And then, just to think about, like, what is a 19 or 20-year-old kid thinking about in their head when they're making those decisions to enlist. And I would imagine certainly a lot of folks are thinking about their family and their friends and their country. And I would imagine there's also a lot of folks who are thinking about these other aspects that you just mentioned.
And one other thing I'm thinking about Grant too, that's what's also not in it got cut out of the film, but he said, if I didn't volunteer for the MIS, I might be dead, because that means I would have gotten drafted into the 442nd and killed in Europe. So he was looking at the MIS as better that way. It was strange to think about, but he could be right. He could have been right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point too. And I think, obviously very different sort of combat situations. And, of course, we know from Roy Matsumoto's story that there was certainly a lot of peril in the Merrill's Marauders. And then we also have other folks that were more behind the lines interpreters, doing translation work, enemy communique. So it's kind of interesting to see that, again, the diversity of experience that people had when they were part of the MIS.
One of the other things that Matsunoshita was telling us about too was, and Roy might have fit into this too, a lot of the Kibe, these are the guys, again, that decided to go back to Japan or were shipped back to Japan to go to school. A lot of them went back to Japan to go to school because they could get a big time degree at, UC Berkeley or something, but they weren't going to get a job when they got out because they were Asian. So they go back to Japan and study, and then they come back to the US, and it's so much better. And they were treated so badly as they were the Hakujin in Japan, right? If you are born in the US and you go back to Japan, the Japanese treated these guys so badly that they came back hating the Japanese, the Kibei, and some of the most effective guys in these MIS in the MIS service were Kibei. They knew the language better than anybody. They knew the customs. They knew everything, but they were the least trusted. But they were the most effective in this unit.
Do you have a sense of how many, like percentage-wise, of the units were Kibei in MIS?
I don't know if there was any kind of official number.
Yeah.
But some of these guys that we even profiled, the biggest heroes were Kibei. A lot of them were, like Roy.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the language and cultural fluency, I would imagine, led to a lot of important knowledge in terms of how the Japanese military was thinking. And I know, at least in Roy's story, there's that moment when he actually calls charge to the enemy line, which ended up saving his guys in the Merrill's Marauders.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting, that reunion that we covered that he'd go to quite often, and his daughter would take him to. I don't think she was all that thrilled to go, but she supported her dad, and he was the king there. He was like he was the main attraction to everything, because they knew what he did in this one unit of all white guys. There's probably a few Latinos in there too, but.
Yeah, so do you get a sense, in terms of the MIS folks that you interacted with, that is interesting to think about other ethnic minorities being in some of those units, and I'm just kind of curious what those dynamics were like. I know that in the 442, for example, there were actually a few Korean Americans that were part of the unit. I'm just kind of curious if you had heard any other stories from the Pacific Front.
No, I haven't heard anything.
None of the stories that we dealt with did, but yeah, nothing I can come up with there.
So now that the film has been out for a few years and it's kind of out there for the public, do you have plans to take this story further, or do you have other projects that you're working on at this moment?
We were talking about trying to help expand that registry out to be more of a, we're still trying to figure this out, really, making it more of an online experience with more, more material. We've got extra scenes that we shot. We saw some stuff in Hawaii that we never put together. Another material that we do have some segments that we built out, but how can we enhance this whole thing with, the sons, daughters, grandsons, grandkids, contributing material, crowdsourcing some of this documents and all sorts of things. Because Seiki's looking for just the facts, ma'am, the serial numbers, basic fact. Yeah, but we're interested in what really happened to these guys, and maybe one family knows of the exploits of their grandfather and who he hung out with, but the other family that knew the grandfather, their grandfather knew their grandfather. You know what I mean? It's like the interconnect the stories isn't transferring from one family to another. How can we kind of facilitate that?
Yeah, so that's, I guess, a work in progress, and certainly would be interested to see how that develops, and if there's ways that our audience can help support that as well. I'm sure people would be interested in knowing that.
Well, in the film, right, when we were in 2011 at the Congressional Gold Medal Ceremony, there was just this big posting where, do you know this guy? There's a picture of their dad or granddad in a photo, and trying to identify other guys in this unit and all these other things that people were trying to find out, probably for decades. Well, maybe something like this could help, get a little bit more information.
And there's been a lot of interest since the film came out too. People are responding on our Facebook page saying that my dad was in the MIS. Can you tell us any more about him? And usually they are on the registry, but there isn't a lot of information about them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a unique challenge because, again, at this point, it's hard to gather that much anecdotal information from the individuals who are gone, particularly if they didn't share a lot of those stories with their children or grandchildren. But I'm wondering, are there military dispatches or other records that the government kept that might help fill in some of those gaps?
There's bits and pieces. Seiki found a lot of that stuff because, they had in St. Louis, they had this big record center for the military that burned down a long time ago, and a lot of records were lost that way. But there are other places where some of these records are. But a lot of the records are maybe the individual have their discharge papers. There's weird things like there was an actual yearbook that was published. In fact, that yearbook was used for some of the names, for actually a lot of the names they were trying to figure out who was in the MIS originally. In the back of this yearbook that came out in 1946. It's weird. They couldn't talk about it, but there's this big yearbook that looks like any other yearbook. They had all the names listed in the back, but it was only the first initial of the first name. So you couldn't really be sure if your granddad was in this unit because it just had a first initial. You'd have to kind of guess in a lot of cases. So that's the absurdity of all of this, that nobody took the care to do a good job retaining the records of these guys. I mean, it was kind of in a weird way to me, kind of a sort of a big slap in the face that there was not good record keeping, that these guys had to figure it out, decades and decades later.
I'm curious to learn more about the yearbook. Was that actually from the language school, or was that just from
it was from Fort Snelling, the Fort Snelling language school. Yeah. And it was just like a yearbook with everybody's headshot in there.
The rec center guys playing ping pong and stuff. It's just like what you would expect, but they hardly got any chance to do that. I mean, they spent most of their time studying Japanese, and getting ready to get deployed. But, I think they had stuff like Glee Club and everything like that, too. It's weird to think about. But
do you have a sense of whether a lot of the MIS guys then ended up serving during the occupation of Japan as well, given their language abilities?
That's a big part of the story. We thought we'd do something with that. We never did. I think they really contributed to the post-war Japan that brings us to Japan of today. The guy really running Japan after the war was General MacArthur. Well, how much Japanese does he speak? Well, these guys were all the interpreters for, the guys taking over the country. So all these Nisei are doing all the real work there, and they're the unsung heroes of post-war Japan. And there's not that much to talk about because they don't talk about it. And we hear stories here and there, and it was remarkable. A few of these guys that we interviewed were making trips to Hiroshima to go look at the devastation of the atomic bomb attack, including Grant and another guy that we didn't put in the film, the Harry Fukuhara, who we went to see in Hawaii. It's incredible. They were that was off limits. That was radioactive, but all these commanders and stuff wanted to go down there, take a look, and they needed an interpreter to go with them. So MIS guys are going and looking at the devastation. And then a guy like Roy Matsumoto, his family was from Hiroshima, and he was there too. He went back there to go find his family. Another part of the story that a lot of that stuff going on.
There's a woman in Minnesota whose father was present at the signing of the surrender of Japan. Was it on the Missouri?
Yeah, that famous photograph. And I mean, there's a famous story.
So he was there as an interpreter.
there's a famous story where, some of these MIS guys are running into their relatives, with the Japanese army, and you hear stuff like that. But since we were trying to contain our film to just a few separate stories, we didn't get into the big, wide history of the MIS. We wanted to just stick to individual stories and try to tell the general experience through them, but we couldn't get into a lot of the really the fun facts to know and tell about this thing that we had to skip, even though we really wanted to get them in there.
We also wanted to show what they're doing today, and those guys, man, when we were shooting them, they were so active. It was almost hard to keep up with them, and they were like late 80s and early 90s, and we couldn't keep up with them.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that, if you're exploring the MIS further in future projects, then definitely telling that story with more depth about the role that the MIS played perhaps in the occupation, if there's a way to tell that story as well. And then also just those connections, like Roy with his family being in Hiroshima, and other individuals who may have come face to face in an interrogation room with relatives of theirs. Because I know that happened on more than one occasion, and would be really interesting to kind of think about that and see that explored a little bit more in a film.
Yeah, the one thing I wish we could do that I realized we never could was Grant Ichikawa, after the war, ended up going into the CIA. Makes sense, military intelligence, service intelligence. Well, when we went to the gold medal ceremony, there's a bunch of these guys sitting at a table. Nisei, all MIS guys, former MIS, all former CIA. There's a bunch of these guys that went into the CIA after the war. A lot of them. And I tried to talk to any one of them about it, and they wouldn't tell us anything. And we went to Grant's basement, and he's got all these plaques on the wall, shaking hands with CIA directors and stuff for all the stuff he did in the CIA after the war. And he had this box of passports with all these different colors, diplomatic, tourist. He was a spy, and he did nothing about it till the CIA decided they were going to have a diversity ceremony. So they had this big celebration for him and another guy. He goes, "I guess the CIA outed me. Now I can talk about it."
Wow.
They were celebrating his career. Another very prominent Japanese American guy in Washington. That's why he lived in Washington, D.C. He was a CIA guy. And there were a ton of these guys, but you'll never hear their stories, ever. And that's what we wanted to try to touch on, but it didn't fit. But it was funny.
Well,
he was
again,
a great guy.
If you have a chance to do something, even a short film related to that, I'm sure that a lot of people would be interested.
That would be interesting, yeah.
It's something you got to write a movie over, one of those narrative things, because that's just impossible. It's like you wouldn't believe it. These people that were totally mistrusted as American citizens during this war are running at these levels as American spies after the war, for us, It's just funny.
We do have another question from the audience. Kelsey Larson asks, this is related to the conversation we had a little bit earlier about the training at Fort Snell. Was that because of the secrecy, or just not thinking it was significant to keep full records of day-to-day training in regards to the lack of information that was available and is available?
I don't know about training records. I think if they existed, Seiki would have found them. That training was Japanese language school training, really, right, in Fort Snelling. I think they did some military drills and that sort of thing, but they spent more of their time hitting the books, just trying to learn Japanese. It was just really a language school, at least for the most part. And when they came out, they were all non-commissioned officers, sergeants probably, and it was kind of irritating because the white unit, the guys over them were all the white soldiers who were all lieutenants and above, you know. And it was only till near the end of the war that you had a few of these Nisei actually becoming commissioned officers, and it was most of them still weren't. You know, Grant became a lieutenant. They gave him a field promotion, but that was really strange to see that all these white guys who the Nisei answered to, who couldn't speak any Japanese, were overseeing all these guys that were bilingual.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not altogether surprising. And as you were mentioning, even with the supreme command of the Allied powers during the occupation, I mean, there can't have been that much oversight over a group of bilingual individuals who, you know, in often case were the only ones who spoke Japanese in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you just kind of had to know that they were the interface. They're the ones that were working with the Japanese dignitaries to turn that whole ship, and had to work both sides of the room, basically.
We have a couple of comments, not questions, but I did want to share these because they're relevant to the conversation. Eileen Lamphere says that our father served as a translator in the OSS. Thanks for sharing that, Eileen.
That was the precursor to the CIA.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the OSS became the CIA after the war. Which is not necessarily, was that necessarily, because the MIS was an Army unit. OSS was not
right.
a military unit,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think.
We have another comment from Patricia Nicholson, who says, my uncle Sho Onodera was MIS, and after the war, he remained to interpret the war crimes trial. 2 of his uncles were admirals in the Japanese Navy.
Wow.
Let's go interview him.
Yeah, I'm curious, did you guys encounter anyone who were present during the war crimes trials? Because that's another interesting passage.
I'm kind of surprised that Grant wasn't, but no, we didn't.
Well, we did go see Harry Fukuhara, who was, I think, involved in a lot of that. But that was part of the story, too, that we cut out of what we were looking at doing, which was Harry, at the time we got to him, was his Alzheimer's had gotten so far along. And that was kind of representative of how we were losing this history. This guy was the guy. He was, in fact, there's a plaque on his wall calling him Mr. MIS. But we didn't get to him in time, and we kind of actually wanted to show that as part of how history is being lost with these guys. Even though they might be in the room, they can't tell you anymore. But I know there was photos of him, I think. Or Roy, too, I think, was close to some of that. Roy Matsumoto.
We have another comment.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Steve.
I was just going to say that, yeah, I wish that we could have put wish we could have fit the Harry Fukuhara piece in there, but it was because it's heartbreaking to see the devastation of Alzheimer's. And here he was, like Bill said, Mr. MIS, and everybody looked up to him. But by the end, he couldn't remember anything that had happened to him.
And his story was very, you know, he was family from Hiroshima, and he went looking for his family, and a lot of them, they died from, radiation poisoning, not soon after he found them. These are the kind of stories, too, that were part of the reality of war. I think that's what it really came down to, and I think we're trying to show that a little. This is war. This is... I think it's crazy if you look at what went on. Everything, again, is this insane situation where, you know, at the time it doesn't seem that way, but looking back, you know, what happened, it's not right. And you just kind of go with what you do and what you know and hope you make it through.
Absolutely. We have another comment from the audience. Raymond Sonoda says, my dad, Jackson from Seattle, was a MIS instructor at Camp Savage. Never knew about it until he passed. He was involved in the tribunal in Japan.
Wow.
That's
And
a typical story. Didn't know.
Right.
And we do have another question from the comments as well. This is from Mieko again. Do you know anything about Nisei vets today since World War II? Are there parallels or differences based on your experiences with the World War II Nisei vets? I'm guessing that Mieko is referring to veterans who served in other wars aside from World War II.
I haven't really looked into that a whole lot. I know that there were some that were in Vietnam. Some stories of people like that, that were in there, and it goes till today, there's some very, but those aren't Nisei, obviously. We're the next generation or two. There was one guy that was in the history books that had served, I think, at Issei in World War I that was prominent in a photo, arriving in camp or being taken away to camp wearing his World War I uniform. But you don't hear too much about people serving outside of the main units, which were the 442nd or the MIS. Although there were a few. I did another documentary about a guy who was in the Army Air Corps that wasn't in a Japanese American unit. Here and there you'll find those strange stories, but for the most part, it's those two units, or the 522nd. They mentioned that, I think, at the medal ceremony. There's another unit too, connected with the 442nd to some degree.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. We have one from the audience. Eileen Lamphere asks, is there a place to find out what our Nisei vets did during the war, not just that they served? As she mentions that she didn't know that her father was a translator until he passed.
Yeah, well, maybe that's our next project. There isn't really anything out there.
There is
that's aggregated, although
museum up in San Francisco.
Yeah.
The national, which is it? The National Japanese
American Historical Society. Yeah.
And they do, because they're based in the Presidio, which is where the first MIS school was, till they got kicked out because they were in California and had to go to Fort Snelling. So there's a few places. Maybe we get your email and we can send you some places on all of this.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank you both for joining us this afternoon. Would you like to leave us with any closing thoughts before we close out the session?
Well, I like to, and this is kind of the philosophy that we had from the beginning of the film is, talk, and it's easier said than done. I have trouble with it myself. Talk to your parents, ask them questions before it's too late. And luckily, I was able to ask my dad a lot of questions, but he's passed away. But I was finally able to have my mom, who is not Japanese, she's Chinese. She told us the story of the family story after I asked her for like 10 years to tell us. And so after, I don't know, 60 years, she finally told us, which was just fascinating. And I think it really made a big impact on all my siblings. Yeah, I mean, as hard as it is, ask your parents questions while they still can, while they still can answer them.
Yeah, that's what you got to do.
Well, thank you both for joining us. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I certainly look forward to seeing what comes next for you both. Please do keep us posted, and yeah, if there are other ways that the audience here can support your work, I'm sure there's a lot of folks who would like to get engaged with that.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.